Imagine going to bed tonight, closing your bedroom door, turning off the lights, and being completely alone. For most people today, that feels completely normal. But from an evolutionary perspective, it may be one of the strangest things humans do. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, sleeping alone was probably not the default. Humans slept near other humans, near family, near fire, and sometimes very close to people who were protecting the group while others slept. So when did that change? When did humans go from sleeping together in shared shelters to putting one person in one room, closing the door, and calling it normal? The surprising answer is, we don't actually know the exact moment, and there may never have been one. Because sleeping alone wasn't an invention. It was the result of a much longer transformation in how humans lived. To understand it, we have to go much further back. Long before beds, long before houses, and even before Homo sapiens. Our closest primate relatives don't normally sleep in isolated bedrooms. Great apes build sleeping platforms, or nests, and these sleeping places are connected to their social lives. The ancestors of humans inherited a world where sleep happened in a physical and social environment, not in a private room behind a locked door. And once our ancestors came down from the trees, sleeping became even more dangerous. On the ground, there were predators, there were rival groups, there was cold, and there was another problem. While you're asleep, you can't watch for any of it. So why would an early human choose to sleep alone? There was almost no obvious advantage. Sleeping next to other people could provide warmth. It could provide protection. And, perhaps most importantly, it meant that someone else might notice danger before you did. This may have shaped human sleep itself. Humans actually sleep less than expected for a primate of our size. A comparative study of 30 primate species found that humans have unusually short total sleep time, while spending a relatively large proportion of that sleep in REM. Researchers have proposed that the risks of sleeping on the ground may have favored shorter, more efficient sleep. In other words, our ancestors may have had to become very good at sleeping quickly. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Archaeologists have actually found evidence of ancient people deliberately creating places to sleep. At Border Cave in South Africa, researchers found evidence of grass bedding dating back at least 200,000 years. People were deliberately creating comfortable sleeping and working surfaces inside the cave. And they weren't simply throwing grass on the floor. The researchers found repeated layers of bedding and evidence that the material was sometimes burned and replaced, possibly as part of maintaining the living area. Think about what that means. 200,000 years ago, people were already designing their sleeping environment. They weren't just collapsing wherever they happened to be. They were making a place specifically for rest. And this wasn't unique to one moment or one species. At Ohalo 2 in what is now Israel, archaeologists found remarkably preserved grass bedding dating to about 23,000 years ago. The bedding was arranged on a constructed floor around a central hearth. The site even preserves evidence of a designated sleeping area. And much earlier, Neanderthal sites also contain evidence interpreted as organized resting and sleeping areas. At Abrique Romani in Spain, researchers identified a zone containing several hearths spaced roughly a meter apart, which they interpreted as evidence consistent with sleeping and resting areas. But notice something. These sites show organized sleeping spaces, not necessarily separate bedrooms, and that distinction is crucial. A group could have a designated place for sleeping without giving every individual their own private space. In fact, the evidence we have points in the opposite direction. For most of human evolutionary history, people probably lived in relatively small groups. And when you live in a small group inside a cave, hut, or temporary shelter, there simply isn't much reason to divide the building into individual bedrooms. The group is the household. The sleeping area is shared. Privacy is limited. And everyone knows everyone else is there. So when did humans start sleeping alone? Maybe the better question is, when did humans start having enough space to sleep alone? Because that requires more than just the idea of privacy. It requires architecture. It requires resources. It requires a social system in which separating people at night is useful or desirable. And that transformation took a very long time. Even today, traditional small-scale societies don't all organize sleep around individual bedrooms. Research among the Hadza hunter-gatherers of Tanzania gives us a fascinating glimpse into how people can adapt their sleeping environments. Researchers studied how grass huts, temperature, sound, and fire affected sleep. The huts reduced variation in thermal stress compared with sleeping outside, and nighttime sound was associated with changes in sleep-wake activity. The important point is that people actively manipulate their environment to make sleeping safer and more comfortable. That may have been happening for a very long time. First came shelter, then controlled fire, then bedding, then increasingly structured living spaces, and eventually, walls began separating people. But here's the strange part. We often think of privacy as something ancient, as if humans have always wanted to close a door and be alone. But anthropologically, that's difficult to defend. For much of human history, privacy was expensive. A separate room requires extra space, extra building materials, extra energy, and a society organized around individual households. For a hunter-gatherer group moving through a landscape, building an entire extra room just so one person can sleep alone would make very little sense. There was also a practical problem. Why isolate the person who might need protection, or who might need to protect everyone else? Sleeping together wasn't necessarily about affection, it was also about survival. But then humans began living differently. Permanent settlements appeared. Homes became more substantial. Families became more structurally separated. And eventually, architecture started creating spaces with specific functions. Cooking could happen in one place, working in another, sleeping somewhere else. And finally, people could sleep behind a wall. But even then, sleeping alone was not necessarily the standard. For a long time, multiple people could still share the same room. Parents and children, siblings, extended family, servants, guests. The idea that every person should have their own private bedroom is much more recent than the existence of beds themselves. And this leads to one of the biggest surprises in the entire story. The bed is ancient. The private bedroom is not. Humans have been creating comfortable sleeping surfaces for hundreds of thousands of years. But the modern idea that a child should sleep in one room, parents in another, and every person should have their own private sleeping space is heavily shaped by relatively recent cultural and architectural changes. Even the idea that infants should routinely sleep separately from their parents is not a universal human pattern. Evolutionary anthropologists have pointed out that dependent human children spent their evolutionary history sleeping in close proximity to caregivers, while separate sleeping became increasingly possible under modern living conditions. So the bedroom door you're closing tonight may represent a surprisingly recent experiment. And here's another twist. Sleeping alone isn't necessarily what our bodies were designed to prefer. Human sleep is incredibly flexible. Different societies organize nighttime activity in very different ways. Some people sleep in one long block. Others have periods of nighttime wakefulness. Some sleep indoors, some outdoors, some sleep near family, others sleep in separate spaces. There is no single universal human sleeping arrangement. But there is one pattern that keeps appearing in our evolutionary story. Humans are extremely good at changing their sleeping environment. We use fire, clothing, shelters, bedding, walls, doors, heating, lighting, and eventually, technology. Instead of adapting ourselves completely to the night, we started adapting the night to ourselves. And that may be the real story behind sleeping alone. It wasn't one invention. It wasn't one civilization suddenly deciding everyone needs their own bedroom. It was a gradual process in which humans gained more control over temperature, predators, darkness, architecture, and social space. The more control we gained, the less necessary physical proximity became. And eventually, something that would have been dangerous or impractical for our ancestors became completely ordinary. One person, one bed, one room, a closed door, silence. So when you lie down tonight and nobody is around, remember how unusual that scene may be from the perspective of human evolution. For most of our history, sleep happened in a social world. People shared shelters, shared warmth, shared fires, shared sleeping spaces, and they adapted their environment together. We don't know exactly when humans first slept alone. There was probably no single moment when it began. But we do know that humans were creating dedicated sleeping spaces at least 200,000 years ago. long before anyone had a concept of a modern bedroom. The strange thing isn't that humans eventually learned to sleep alone. The strange thing is how recently we gained the ability to make solitude at night feel completely normal. And maybe tonight, when you close your bedroom door, you're not doing something ancient. You're doing something remarkably new.